I'd always wanted to go on a discovery expedition. Something exploratory. Uncover a new breed of animal or species of plant. Or maybe an evolutionary offshoot. Something that had been hidden away like a secret by Mother Nature. To be discovered. Or not. I'd been shortlisted to lead the Amazonia expedition, which had gone into the Amazon Basin in the Javari Valley near the Peru border. They had been given a route directly from FUNAI, which is Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Department, created to protect the native populations in the interior of the basin. The route we were given led around the 14 known native tribes that had lived untouched for their entire existence in the rainforest. They had lived among the dangerous animals, insects, and weather, developing their own forms of neuropathic medicines. From the roots of the Maasai tree being ground up to aid in kidney health, to the tawari tree bark used in anti-cancer treatments, to the cordoncillo with its anesthetic properties. The many tribes had discovered the secret of the Amazon. In fact, the Matses tribe, who inhabit the border region between Peru and Brazil, had created a 1,000-page encyclopedia of their traditional medicines, with the assistance of 5 shamans and a conservation group. The Matses were doing this because they feared they as a tribe were falling into extinction. They may not have thrived, but they did survive. They'd been given help from the government, making them and their portions of the rainforest into protected classes and regions. Heavy fines and even jail time were imposed on outsiders if anyone approached the tiny villages. We could harbor diseases that we had already overcome with our immune systems and medicine. This was particularly ironic, as we were going in to find treatments amongst them for our ailments, which they already overcome with their immune systems and medicine. The mission was privately funded, which just meant one of the big pharma giants wanted to keep it low-key. This also meant there'd likely be line crossing in different ways. Typically, I didn't like engaging with the possibility of an expedition outside of universities, as the funding would be pulling all the strings and the research would be highly classified. This one was no different. But I applied anyway. It came down to me and Philip Dwyer. Dr. Dwyer was a professor of archaeology, but held doctorates in biology, focusing on mycology and phycology, which is why he was chosen. Not that I wasn't well versed in the topics, but he was a giant in that world, and everyone else was just reflecting in the gleam of his armor. I had more or less forgotten about the expedition after I received the thanks but unfortunately letter, but checked back periodically to see if there was any news of discoveries, which there weren't. In fact, it had been incredibly tight-lipped. That is, until I'd seen Dr. Dwyer's obituary. The cause of death wasn't listed, and I couldn't find anything online. I received a phone call, and the answers slowly started presenting themselves. The man on the other end was named Rayburn. He was involved in the preparation and funding of the Amazonia expedition. They were sending another team in, and wanted to offer me the position of lead researcher. I said yes before I had a chance to think about it, and plans were made to get me to South America. I was flown to a private airstrip near the Peru-Brazil border, where we drove as far as roads would take us into the rainforest. A camp was set up there for us, where the team had been prepping before descending into the interior. I finally met Rayburn and was able to ask all the questions that had been building up since the phone call. Rayburn explained that a private land mapping organization had been using a series of drones with highly advanced sensor technology to chart the floor of the Amazon and the animals and life that filled it. Certain animals fed on certain insects, which fed on certain plants which carried certain properties which were highly beneficial and profitable to Western medicinal corporations. The company had discovered how to chart and make highly accurate predictions on where certain plant species would be found based off this reverse-engineered food chain algorithm. What they had discovered was the Terranado Valley and the remnants of a lost civilization rivaling the Mayans. There had been structures detected in the deep gorge, several of which had been carved into the mountain and appeared to continue under the rocky elevation. The last known coordinates of the previous expedition was at the bottom of the valley, in what was being referred to as the mortal interior. That was where we were headed. Finally, I got to ask about Dwyer. Rayburn appeared to have been trying to avoid it. He explained the doctor had been the only one of the previous expedition to make it out of the jungle alive, which was how we had all the information we did. And the information was incredibly promising. Dwyer had made extensive notes in his work journal, but half of them had been burned beyond recognition. When I asked how that happened, Rayburn admitted it was a part of Dwyer's suicide. The doctor was the only member to make it to the city, but within minutes, he had set himself on fire and everything he had with him. The spine of the notebook and the left half of each page survived. I was allowed to comb through it on the last leg of the drive before we abandoned the roads and trails. Dwyer had discovered a new species in the family of Apocynaceae. It was almost identical to the Catharanthus roseus, which is known as the Madagascar periwinkle, bright eyes, and the graveyard plant among others. There were two main points to the discovery that Dwyer highlighted. The first highlight was the obvious one, and the one he was the most excited about. The plant was used to treat leukemia, Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin lymphoma, brain tumors, advanced stage breast and testicular cancer, as well as diabetes and malaria. It was a juggernaut, but this one species he claimed had groundbreaking therapeutic properties, including an insulin-stimulating supercharged vincoline alkaloid. That alone would revolutionize treatments for most, if not all, forms of diabetes, possibly even cure it. The second highlight, however, was the vexing one. This plant wasn't found in the Amazon, or anywhere in Brazil, or South America. It's native, exclusively, to Madagascar. Though it can be grown elsewhere ornamentally, a species this distant in its evolutionary trek and this far removed from its origin point could not possibly progress to how he was describing. And yet, that's what he had found. But not just that. Dozens and dozens of other species of plant, molds and fungi. Microbial ecology was a serious interest of mine, and I had done research papers on how fungi played crucial roles in policing rainforest biodiversity. What I discovered was that fungi prevented the success of any dominant species of closely packed plants by infecting and quickly spreading between them. This would enable a wider range of differing species to flourish. Acting as the main decomposers of ecological systems, growth is the fungi's means of mobility. The more they eat, the more they expand and travel. They also don't require photosynthesis, which means they flourish in some of the most impossible conditions. He wrote about advanced forms of polyphyletic slime molds, biotrophic mycoparasites, advanced and aggressive flagellates with powerful spore delivery systems, pyrenomycetes and frightening mutations of the Amanita virosa, the Podostroma cornudami, and giant strains of angel wings and deadly dapperlings. So many of those weren't native to that area or that hemisphere and wouldn't survive in these conditions. Shouldn't. And yet, Dwyer documented them all. We arrived at the final base camp and met everyone that was going in. There was a small team of mercenaries who had been hired to make the trip as safe as possible this time. It was led by a man named Miller, with a jawline like a refrigerator. I hoped I wouldn't have to deal with him often. Rayburn had also bought twice as many local guides, paying triple what he did the previous group. This was a results-based mission, and had to yield them. We left at dawn on foot, 2 of the guides leading and the rest carrying large canoes overhead for us. We had been portaging through several swamps between the lengthy hikes that brought us further into uncharted land. Places feet hadn't walked before, deeper than any tribes had gone. Well, not any tribes. Not the one they had supposedly found. I heard bird calls, wings fluttering, animal movements, twig snapping, growls and grunts, slithering, buzzing, hissing, running water somewhere nearby. At night, the howler monkey screeched and the brightly colored tree frogs cackled like witches. And all the while, My own heartbeat was thumping through my ears. And it was hot. So hot, I sweat through everything I brought in the first hour. There was also the pungent smell of damp, decomposing trees and decaying vegetation, plants and shrubbery. The difficulty of walking became evident quickly. The rainforest floor was covered in rocks, fallen trees, brambles and dead leaves covering the ground under it. Or what might be creeping and crawling just below our feet. The first day, we made it 8 miles into the depths of the rainforest, which was almost half as far as we had planned. This was all of particular concern, because there had been a storm front detected brewing just off the coast of Lima, and was looking to be headed inland. Before we left, there had been a conversation of whether or not to wait it out. But in this case, money spoke, and everyone agreed. The sounds shifted from morning to day to night, with a rotating chorus of taunting chaos piercing through the jungle. The morning of the third day, we moved to canoes. Miller was told to keep his men on alert, as the waters were filled with black caimans. They were the largest of the crocodilian family and could grow up to 6 meters in length. And they were violently carnivorous. We took to the shore for the night to sleep, and the mercenaries traded shifts on watch overnight. It was incredibly dangerous, but we were behind in time and needed to make up for it. The heat and the mosquitoes upped their assault on my sanity. You couldn't escape either. That night, a roar of gunfire woke me up. One of the mercenaries, Stevens, was dead. He had an arrow through his throat. Then, I saw the other 4 bodies. They were natives, part of the Satere tribe. They appeared to be a twilight hunting party and had stumbled upon our campsite. Stevens must have spooked them, and they put an arrow through his Adam's apple. We didn't know how many more were nearby, but the merc stayed on high alert for the rest of the night. In the morning, we buried Stevens and left the bodies of the Satere to be claimed either by their tribe or by the jungle. I felt horrible about it, but also frightened. The Satere were an intense tribe, and now had no reason to come after us. I'd read stories about them, some firsthand, others passed on from so-and-sos. They had a painful rite of passage for the boys to endure to be accepted into manhood. It involved experiencing the worst pain the jungle has to offer. And this came in the form of the Paraponera clavata, or the bullet ant. It is said to have the most painful sting of any insect. True to its name, the sting is allegedly comparable to being shot with a bullet and can last up to 24 hours. For their manhood ritual, the Maui boy would have 2 gloves filled with bullet ants placed on his hands for no less than 5 minutes. When it was removed, the boy would shake uncontrollably for hours and experience hallucinations, disorientation, and muscle paralysis. To complete the ritual and be accepted as a man by the tribe, the boy would need to endure this practice a total of 20 times over the course of months, sometimes years. And those boys, now grown up into strong, resilient, and deadly shadows in the forest, might be hunting us. Not only that, we discovered 2 of the guides were gone. Their extra clothes and supplies were still in their sleeping bags, but it looked like they had been taken in the night. We never found out what happened to them. Back in the canoes, the sounds continued to follow us. Like a warning was being sent out to whatever lay ahead. We couldn't tell if the sounds were actual bird calls or from native vocal cords. I saw movement under the boat, in the water below us. Something large, tube-like, scaled. It was a green anaconda, a giant one. Our guides motioned for everyone to raise their paddles out of the water and hold our movements. I watched as the massive snake zigzagged under our canoe, its lengthy body seemingly never ending. It must be over 40 feet long. Somewhere nearby, there was a splash, then another one, and another. The mercenaries lifted their guns pointing at the water and tree line, waiting for a target to present itself. Movement caught my peripherals. On the back of the guide in front of me, a little feeler poking up. An Amazonian giant centipede. It was crawling up his back towards his long hair, where it would vanish in it. I looked over the edge and saw the anaconda's tail disappear ahead of the canoe, and the water below was settled. I quickly flicked the giant centipede off the guide's back and into the water. It must have been over a foot long and 2 inches thick. We finally made it back to shore, and were back on foot for what would be another full day of cutting our way through the dense forest. One of the mercenaries went down after being bitten by a musurana. Thankfully, we carried a full pharmacy of antidotes for the vast categories of venoms from snakes, spiders, and insects we'd come across. The 4th day, the jungle sound stopped. It was like someone had pressed a mute button. Animals and insects alike had been prevalent throughout the journey, but at one point, it seemed like they came no further. And shortly after the introduction of silence, we arrived at the Terranado Valley. We couldn't see it, of course, as the canopies below blocked it out. An old pathway was discovered, carved into the flat rock face of the gorge. It led down the otherwise sheer side of the mountain. We left the canoes above and descended with only the equipment we could carry. It was frightening staring down, following the age-worn stairs as they disappeared into the canopies of dense trees. As we got closer to the canopies, we dropped below the tree line, and all the terror I felt disappeared and was replaced by absolute wonder. I stared down at dozens of small 1 to 2 story structures carved into the side of the rocky decline. Other small homes were built out of what appeared to be huge cyclopean blocks of limestone, clay and mud, and lined the floor of the valley. So, there was a city here. That much from Dr. Dwyer was true. I tried to keep my eyes on the narrowing path ahead of me, but it was impossible not to drift back to the monumental discovery below. This town had a large straight line across its center, with markings throughout the structures, which were built around it. The sunlight was beaming down on one of the markings. I looked up and saw there was a wide opening among the various canopies above. The sunlight found the hole and streaked across the town. Following the line from one end to the other, it suddenly occurred to me. The tribe had built the structures in that way, creating that line with markings to use the shifting light from above as a sundial to tell time. Fascinating. At the far end of the markings, where the sun disappeared and it signaled dusk had arrived, was what appeared to be the main mountain entrance to whatever was inside. Presumably more structures. A half hour into climbing down the mountain path, Miller, who was leading us, stopped, and a discussion was had with Rayburn. After a few minutes, we continued forward, and I got to see what the issue was. There was a man on the path, clearly a member of the previous expedition. He was laying on his back, dead. A large, frightening protuberance had erupted out of his chest. It looked like a sharp, petrified tree branch with thorns spiking out of the sides. We took turns stepping over him, and it became more unsettling when I noticed the man hadn't been picked apart by animals, insects, maggots, or anything. He was just slowly decomposing, his skin going as white as the growth spewing from his chest. The rest of the walk down, the man was all I could think about. There was another half hour of careful foot placement to go. How had he made it this far? We finally reached the bottom of the path and walked out amongst the structures. They were incredible to witness. They weren't just common mud huts. They were built with monolithic blocks of solid limestone layered on top of one another. There were colossal rock shapes balancing on others, making Stonehenge look like child's play. I was immediately reminded of the story of a Latvian immigrant who had built a coral castle in Homestead, Florida. He's the only man to claim to know the secrets of how Egyptian pyramids were built, and supported the claim by single-handedly constructing an entire complex of blocks of coral weighing up to 30 tons each in his backyard. Inside the castle walls were numerous puzzles yet to be solved. Though the man had been contacted by universities, engineers, technologists, and even the government, he kept the secrets with him and brought them to his grave. The tribe, whoever they were, had discovered the same principles, methods, and techniques of building these structures. Miller and the mercenaries led us through the town. Guns pointed up and into the dark and empty openings of the complexes. It was eerie, with the only sounds in this massive valley coming from us. We made our way down the gorge into the large crevice with the grand carved entrance. The sunlight was at a point in the sky where it angled in the canopy opening above and through the rocky threshold, lighting far into what appeared to be a massive cavern. We climbed a lengthy staircase with carvings on the kicker place up to the entryway. We entered through the large, beautifully structured archways into a small hallway. The walls were covered in carvings in multiple languages. Then, there were the hieroglyphs, clearly Egyptian, but that was as far as any of us could tell. There were images carved into the ceiling, portraying battles between kings and foreign rulers, gods and men and creatures. The walls were also lined with holders for torches, and every 4 feet, a fire pit. As I admired the artwork and presumed documented history of the tribe, the light reflecting into the hallway began to dim. Leaves blew in, scuttling along the ground, passing us and into the large cavern ahead. Thunder erupted into the distance. The light vanished from the tiny openings in the canopies above, as clouds overtook the skies. We were thrown into twilight. The air whipped past us in a chilled breeze and whistled through the massive chamber. The storm was here, and we were about to be pushed into the large caverns for the night. No one liked the idea, but the reality was we were now going to be stuck here for several days, a week maybe, and these storms could last even longer. The rain hit, and we knew we were bunking in the main cavern for the night. We just had to explore it and find the safest place. The cavern itself was a magnificent sight. Though it was dark, we did have powered lights and small generators, as well as flares to take in our surroundings. There were dozens of entryways and stairways that led to walking tunnels and small rooms. The further in we got, the more it appeared to be a mass housing complex carved into the rock that extended far into the mountain. The center of the large cavern appeared to act as some kind of courtyard, and in the middle was a 30-foot wide hole. It was surrounded by large fire pits. The hole dropped 40 feet down into the earth. At the bottom, there were massive limestone formations, a labyrinth of jagged, needle-shaped rocks that had been formed by erosion and pointed up like a naturally arranged bear trap. A horrible stench emanated from it. As our lights moved further down, we saw skeletons. Some were impaled, and still somehow stuck on the spears. Others were on the floor of the hole. I could only assume it was a sacrificial pit. Most tribes across the planet had some version of the same practice, an offering or ritual slaughter to appease the gods. At the bottom, there were strange holes formed into the side of the pit. They were varying sizes and shapes, but circled the walls, leading in every direction. There was a strange fungus mushrooming out of some of the holes in the cracks, and slimes creeping out from others. I couldn't identify the growths from where I was, and I had a sneaking suspicion I wouldn't be able to, even if I was standing right next to them. One of the flashlights hit the torso and left arm of what looked like one of the previous team, impaled on a limestone spike. It had been a month and a half since they disappeared, and the body was still juicy. The kites were growing more fearful. Even the mercenaries were giving each other nervous looks. My foot tapped against something, and I looked down to see what resembled a scarab shell or exoskeleton. But the closer I looked, it appeared more organic and plant-based, or fungi, or some mix of the two. What many don't know about mushrooms is they're a perfect blend of animal and plant. And this looked like its evolutionary track had grown faster, far expanding its reach down here. I inspected it further. It was a little thing, with tiny sharp bristles and hooks sticking out in all directions. It must use them to latch onto prey. The storm began to rage outside and swept into the large cavern in gusts. We set up a campsite inside and a perimeter around it. Not that I thought anyone would sleep. As tired as we all were, the rotten stench from the death pit was unshakable. I stayed up, going back over Dwyer's damage to workbook, but my mind kept floating back to the hole, the storm, us being stuck here. Though we were safe from the storm in here, we'd have to have a real conversation about what we were going to do in the morning. If the storm was as bad or worse than expected, we could expect a flood, and the last place we want to be is the bottom of a valley in the jungle. What many don't know is, this region is home to over 2.5 million insect species, tens of thousands of plants and fungi, and several thousand different bird and mammal genus. And they're all be coming over the edge from above and slamming down on top of us with hundreds of tons of rainwater. I put the book away, but couldn't sleep. My anxiety was riding high about the storm, so I decided to go out to the entrance and see for myself. I told the mercenaries, and they told me to keep close and not stumble off. They didn't want to come find me. Outside of the entrance was complete and utter darkness. The canopy above acted like blackout blinds, shuttering any illumination caused by the lightning. Though I'd get brief millisecond snapshots of the town as some light snuck through. The windows and doorways of the structures were empty still. I don't know why I thought I'd catch the eyes of previous inhabitants staring back up at me, wondering who the trespassers were and what they were doing in their town. A chill settled into my bones, and all I wanted was to be back in my sleeping bag. I stayed up for another hour in my tent, before finally falling asleep. I'm not sure how long I was out, but it was still night when I woke up. A scream echoed through the cavern and shook us all. I could see the spotlights shooting on from around the perimeter, and the massive shadow of something on the outside of my tent, pressing in towards me. It was long, with multiple legs, scratching and grabbing at the nylon fabric separating us. I tore my way out of the opposite zippered side, and saw what looked like a giant centipede, over 20 feet at least, mashing into my tent and sleeping bag. Gunfire roared out, with the centipede taking heavy fire on its armored siding. The bullets eventually pierced through, and the creature shrieked out, and it was blown apart. My ears rang as more gunfire and explosions from hand grenades erupted. I turned to run, but nearly tripped over a grotesque sight. There was a guide on the ground. An even larger centipede than the first one had eaten the man's entire left leg and was working its way into the man's hips and waist. The creature must have used some neurotoxin when it first bit down into him to paralyze the man, and then started feasting, the man feeling all of it. I heard a metal can hit the ground and roll underneath the centipede and the guide. Then, my ears popped, and I felt heavy pressure jettison me back, and I landed on another guide who'd been chewed in half. The mercenaries were unloading every bullet and grenade they had. I found Rayburn, and we rushed over to Miller, who was barking orders. They appeared to have it mostly under control now. There had been only 4 of the giant centipedes, all of which were blown to hell now. A scream shrieked from the edge of the hole. One of the guides, the last one, was being pulled over the edge of the hole and disappeared. I yelled that we needed him. He was the one keeping track of our location by clocking our course on the map. The map he carried with him everywhere in his backpack. We at least needed that. Miller quickly gathered who was left. There was Rayburn and 2 other mercs named Dawkins and Wyatt. Only 5 of us now. We started out with 23 men. Miller wanted to drop explosive charges into the hole, but we reminded him that we'd destroyed the map if it hadn't been already. The team quickly pulled together a grappling system to lower us down to the bottom of the hole, avoiding the limestone spikes. I was given one of the dead mercenary setups, with some kind of long-barreled rifle with a magazine attached, a handgun, and a half a dozen grenades. All I knew about either of the guns was where the safety was, where the trigger was, and where the dangerous end was. We lowered down to the bottom of the pit. I told everyone to avoid touching any of the slimes or molds along the walls of the hole. In fact, avoid touching literally everything except the map, when and if we found it. At the bottom, we found ourselves staring at several varying sized tunnels, ranging from us not being able to fit to us being able to easily walk into upright. It was an easy decision which tunnel to enter, as the blood smears from the guide led into one roughly shorter than me. We could see movement down the tunnel, and Miller led the way in. We got 20 feet in before we arrived in a large chamber. In the center, there were 3 smaller centipedes, 12 to 15 feet in length, feasting on the guide's lower half. His upper half, including his backpack with the map, was just feet away from them. Miller got Dawkins and Wyatt to flank his sides as they entered the chamber. Rayburn and I followed slowly, staying just outside the chamber. I could hear a frightening scuttling sound from all over the walls, like the wings of bats mixed with the clicking of beetles. Miller quietly pulled the backpack off the dead guy's destroyed torso and started to back up. But as he did, his heel clicked down on an old bone and the crack echoed through the chamber. The centipedes turned and saw fresh blood had entered their home. Dawkins and Wyatt started spraying bullets at the creatures. But this was a mistake. The walls began to move and all those scuttling sounds took flight. The air became filled with those little scarab-like creatures from the exoskeleton I found. They were moth-like but fungi-based, with the sharp, pronounced flagellates that characterized them microbially. The ground swirled, rattling joined into the cacophony. So much rattling. Rayburn and I sprinted back through the tunnel, Miller on our heels to keep up. I only looked back briefly, but saw Dawkins and Wyatt swarmed by the tiny creatures, clawing and biting into the exposed flesh, and small puffs of dark smoke spraying out of them like cephalopod ink. Only, this wasn't to distract. It was to kill. Rayburn, Miller and I made it out of the tunnel, but heard more and more sounds of varying magnitudes erupting from the different entrances. A massive, frightening black pop of an organism had spilled out of one of the opening and was creeping its way through the spikes towards us. Looking at it, all I could think was how much it resembled a magnified version of an aggressive cancer cell. Only slime and fungi based, eating and expanding and moving and eating, always hungry, never content. A grenade landed right in its center, and another 2 grenades were tossed into the hole we just come from. Miller yelled for us to hit the deck. All 3 explosions went off in a row, but when the first one did, it sprayed the gelatinous fungi creature all over the tunnel in a massive fuck-up on Miller's part. Globs of it hit Miller's back and began to eat through his gear. The second double explosion sent me flying into the entrance of a new tunnel. I landed just feet away from one of the guides. The tunnel was coated in a foul, oozing fungus with large mushrooms in the shapes of fingers reaching out. The guide was being absorbed into the side of the wall. Half his face was now the same color and texture of the growths. And he was still alive. His skin was sliding off his body and joining a horrific quilt-like patchwork of other skins, all looking like they belonged to our team or the previous one. I saw at least 5 sets of faces on it, rippling like a cancerous waterbed. The guide's arm ripped and pulled away from his body. It started to crawl towards me. Rayburn pulled me up and led me back to the ropes. Smoke was coming out of the tunnel, but I could hear the scuttling starting up again. We attached the ropes and quickly pulled ourselves up, climbing around the expanding fungi, spreading out and reaching to touch us. Rayburn tried to climb past one, but it sprayed out a dark gas at him. The vapor looked corrosive and quickly burned into his clothes and skin. Miller kept firing down, reloading, firing, reloading, firing. He was the lone reason we made it out of the pit. I only turned back once and saw shadows coming up behind us, occasionally lit by the muzzle flashes of Miller's machine gun. And in those short blinks of light, I saw nightmarish creations of nature that nearly drove me into a state of fear-induced paralysis. But Rayburn was there and kept yelling at me to climb. I crawled over the edge and back into the large main cavern, pulling Rayburn up. His skin was going black in large blotches, like he had been afflicted by a rapid form of frostbite. But he kept moving and fired back down into the pit. I turned and saw the bodies of the mercenaries and remaining guides were all gone now from the former campsite, and large snail-like creatures appeared to be absorbing or drinking the remaining blood on the ground. There was flustering above, and I caught glimpses of bats with multiple sets of wings, dipping down, nipping at us. The jungle storm was raging outside, and all I could think of, plan-wise, was to hide in one of the exterior structures in the town and try to get up the pathway when and if the storm eases at dawn. I hoped the way up wasn't washed out. Miller climbed out of the pit. Open wounds in the form of sharp slashes lined his body. He tried to run forward with us, but something from the pit stopped him. Two giant pedipalps, one over each shoulder, slammed down and a spray of blood erupted from Miller's mouth. The guide's backpack dropped from his hands. A series of long furry legs spread out behind Miller and pulled him back down into the depths to feast. I believe I'd just seen a branch of the genus Phonotria, or the Brazilian wandering spider. And it was the size of an SUV, and there were more. Rayburn sparked a flare, and screeches erupted from the hole, like the mere touch of illumination on their skin had been caustic. I grabbed Rayburn by the shoulder, who was now wincing from pain with every step, and we rushed from the hallway that led out. Rayburn was fumbling through his back and pulled out a rectangular-shaped explosive. I recognized it as a C4 charge. He clicked the timer and dropped it as we ran. A disturbing symphony of ghastly sounds erupted from the depths of the pit, chasing us out onto the rain-slaked and crumbled stairway down. The C4 exploded, sending us flying over the staircase and landing hard on the ground. I was dizzy, and a dust had settled over the town, hanging in the air like frozen rain. We might as well have been at the bottom of the ocean, or the deepest realms of space. Movement zoned me right back in. In front of me, a yellow eye appeared through the fog. As it got closer, I saw it was a giant anaconda, its face the size of a dinner table, but half of it blown away from the C4 explosion. It was alive though, and it was locked onto me. It came at me fast, but a spatter of gunfire roared up from beside me. Rayburn was on his back, struggling to get up, but had his machine gun out, firing it off at the massive snake. The anaconda was hit hard and quickly slithered off into the fog. I picked up Rayburn, who could barely jog now. I led him straight down the town's throughway, then off to the right. I saw the rocky pathway up. It was still far enough away, but it looked beautiful, like a literal stairway to heaven etched into the side of the mountain. Rayburn dropped, screaming out. His knees were bleeding, and the blackened part of his body had solidified and felt like hardwood. I tried to help him along, but he couldn't move forward, and he certainly couldn't make it up the rainy and broken track up and out of this hellhole. The rain was pouring down on us, and leaves and branches were battering the town. I looked back, but couldn't see the opening of the cavern. I led Rayburn into one of the tall structures and brought him up to our room on the second floor. He laid down, becoming very still. I watched him die over the course of a few minutes. His entire body blackened and solidified, then cracked open like burnt wood. The effects of the slime molds in the pit were rapid and devastating. I was too terrified to move. I just sat there and thought to myself, trying to break down as much of the events as I could. The different insects and fungi, highly advanced, were very susceptible to light. That much was clear. The pit had been lined with large fire pits surrounding it. The halls had torch holders and smaller fire pits. I imagined the entire cavern had been filled with them, though we hadn't really gotten to explore. Just as the research paper I'd read had proposed, the fungi kept the ecosystem down there in check. Though it was a continuously hungry and feeding organism, it had a built-in evolutionary directive dating back to its first ancestors of single-celled life forms needing more life to survive. I thought through all the papers I had peer-reviewed, and remembered one about a sinkhole-prone region in coastal Romania called the Mobile Cave. Geologists had breached a cavern that was filled with blind creatures that hadn't seen the sun in 5 million years. The life forms had adapted naturally to the extreme cold and darkness, and thrived. The cave had developed the only fully subterranean ecosystem known to science. We appeared to have found something somewhat similar. Rayburn's body spasmed, his head tilted to the side, and his forehead began to expand, pushing outwards. I realized it was going to explode, likely to spread some kind of spores into its immediate environment. I clutched the gun I didn't know how to use and the guide's back, and rushed out in the hallway and towards the room at the back of the structure. I got into the room and heard a small, meaty explosion from Rayburn's head. Then, tiny flutterings, screeches, cries, silence. I looked out through the windows and could see the trail up from here. I turned back and saw something in the corner. No, someone. A man. He appeared to be a member of the previous team. He was long since dead. Similar to the first member we saw in the middle of the path, this man had horrific growths exploding out of him. But this time, the petrified wood-looking mold had come out of his throat, dislodging his jaw, which hung down near his chest now. A machine gun rested in his lap. The man had written on the wall, in his own blood, and they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name, Apollyon. I wasn't up to date on my Bible verses, but I assumed the R stood for Revelations. The rest didn't fill me with hope. I stared at the man, who had clearly thought he could wait out whatever was coming after him. I wondered how many more previous team members were littered throughout the structures, having hoped for the same thing. I checked out the window opening in the wall and saw, with a brief flash of lightning, the tail end of a giant centipede entering the first floor doorway to the structure I was in. They had found us. Of course they had. Our smells probably hung in the air like some delicious bath of breadcrumbs. I had to get out. I grabbed my supply vest, gun and backpack, along with the guide's pack. I climbed out of the window and lowered myself to the roof of the next level. The wooden panels below supported me for one step, before collapsing in and dropping me on top of the centipede on the first floor. The creature shrieked, twisting and snapping and trying to get at me. I squeezed my fist holding the machine gun, and it exploded rounds into the ground and up under the side of the creature. The centipede panicked and slithered its long body out of the window. I climbed out of a window opening on the opposite side and found myself back on the main walkway, getting pummeled by the rain. To the right, I saw the pathway that would lead me up. It was about 40 feet away. I didn't look left. I just ran. I could hear horrible screeches shaking the town under the roar of a constant thunder, and only caught glimpses of my surroundings as the sporadic lightning snuck through the canopy opening. But I heard and saw enough to know something was right behind me. I turned, gripping the trigger again and showering whatever was behind me with bullets. The muzzle flash lit what I believe was a bullet ant the size of a grizzly bear. My shots had covered its face, and it frantically pulled back, darting down a side alley. I couldn't imagine what one of those creatures' bites would feel like. I turned back and kept sprinting, pulling the one flare I knew I had out. I was gonna need it on the climb up. It'll last the first 5 minutes, so if I moved quickly, I could be just out of the creature's reach. I hoped. I got to the pathway up and found it hadn't been affected by the storm. I climbed the first few steps and sparked the flare, using it to find my footing until I was high enough away. I looked back, but the town was swallowed up in the darkness of the storm. Lightning had stopped, but thunder had multiplied, popping my ears. I kept climbing. I was 30 feet up, 40 feet, 50 feet. The flare burned out. All I had were 2 flashlights now. I turned back and saw movement on the path below me, rushing upwards quickly. It was low to the ground, a centipede. I fired several rounds down, but wasn't hitting it. I reached into the supply bag and found a half-dozen set of grenades. I took one and threw it down the path. It bounced off and went over the edge, exploding mid-air. It lit up the side of the wall, and I saw the massive Brazilian wandering spider again. It was coming straight up for me. I took another grenade and held it for a moment longer, then threw it down at the encroaching centipede. This time, it landed perfectly. It blew up in the creature's face and took off a chunk of the pathway, making it now inaccessible without special climbing gear. That took care of the centipede. I looked back down and saw the spider was getting closer. He was right below me, so I took out another grenade and dropped it. The spider pivoted on the wall, narrowly avoiding the explosion and continuing up. I sprayed the last bullets of the magazine down at it, and just as it clicked empty, 2 of the arachnid's legs were blown off by the ammo. It fell back to the town. As it did, it passed the globular organism, which was slinking its way up to the side of the mountain as well. And it was advancing faster than me. It was going to cut me off, up ahead on the path. I had to quicken my pace. I knew I had 4 grenades left, which I would likely need all of for this thing. I was 10 feet from it as it was getting closer to the path ahead. I decided now was the time. I pulled out the grenade rack and snapped the pins out of all 4. I leaned over the edge of the path and underhand through the package at a slithering blob. It was a perfect throw, and the timing couldn't have been better. The creature blew apart, sending small and large bits of it falling back down to the town. But the pathway couldn't sustain the explosion either, and it started to crumble, chunks falling down below. I rushed up the path, trying to get past the collapsing section. I felt my legs go out as the entire rock slab shook. Every move now was critical as I scrambled, fingernails breaking off and fingertips shredding. I managed to just barely get a hand grip ahead and pull myself up just as the path below me crumbled away. The rocky debris was landing on the creatures below. There were so many more species of everything that I'd previously seen. The things of nightmares. The things you wish were made up. The lone moment I saw them with the spark of a lightning bolt, I would never be the same man I was. Knowing these things were possible made me fear for humanity's future. But the storm hadn't slowed down, and it was a long way to the top. I pushed through the canopy, taking a moment for one final look at the small structures, the town, the movement of things that would hopefully never leave this place. Then, I continued on and up, finally getting to the top of the path. I made my way to the site we stashed the canoes in and found 2 extra supply bags in the tent. But I couldn't sleep here. I grabbed the smallest of the canoes and 2 paddles, just in case, and began dragging them through the jungle. I knew a good chunk of the way for the next several hours and could follow our previous paths from the markings we'd left. Even though I was beyond exhausted, I didn't want to stop moving. When I was far enough away, I could pull out the guide's backpack, look over the map, and figure out the rest of the way back. I walked until dawn peeked through the storm clouds, and I found myself in a small clearing. It felt like a divine moment. Somehow, I had survived, and found this perfect instant where the storm opened up. The sun had found this break in the canopies and was shining down on me. It gave me warmth and courage to tackle the trip back to civilization. I ate the food I had left over and rested. After a brief nap, I decided to keep moving and open up the guide's bag. The map wasn't in it. The bag had some clothes, a flask, rolling tobacco, and some dried meats, but no map. I knew I could find my way to the next river launch, but from there, this place was a maze. Swampland leading to lakes, leading to waterfalls, leading to caves, leading to more swampland. I wanted to throw my hands in the air and give up, but the sun from above kept shining down on me, and I kept moving. I found my way back to the river and remembered we came at it from the right, so I'd go left and follow it until I hopefully recognized another marker. The water was calm, but who really knows what's going on a foot under the surface? I had visions of running into the giant anaconda, the black caimans, the Maui tribe. I imagined they found the bodies of their dead at our old campsite by now and were looking for us. Up ahead, I saw a small peninsula I recognized as one we had launched from to get in this stretch of water. I could see one of our old campsites and decided to stop there for the night. The jungle was especially loud, and I had nightmares about all kinds of creeping and crawling things, nesting under my skin and poking out from open wounds. I felt a sharp pain through my leg and woke up. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and found a large spider bite on my calf. I couldn't find the spider though, so I didn't know how bad it was, or how much time I had. I quickly heated up a knife using a lighter and pressed the heated blade into the bite. Hopefully, that would kill some of the venom, but the toxin was already flowing through my veins. I got up and started moving, hoping I'd be able to keep going. Quickly, I felt like I was on a treadmill that was getting shorter with every step. I dragged the canoe an hour before I gave up and collapsed. My vision was going blurry. All my senses felt like they were shortening out. The edges of my sight were vibrating with red spots. I started blacking out, then coming back to. I remember seeing flashes of faces, dark-skinned, aboriginal, native. But the fever dream that had taken over was incomprehensible. I knew what the toxin was doing in my blood. But why was it showing me these people? Was it guilt for the men we had killed and left? Maybe this was the jungle's way of settling its due. My vision went black for good, and I felt my body being moved. Then, nothing. I woke up a week later in the hospital. The faces I had seen had been the Maui tribe. They'd found me, taken care of me, and given me their own medicine, then brought me to the nearest village. From there, I was driven to a hospital and flown to a larger one in Lima, where I was stabilized. I'll likely never be able to thank them. I was going to have to give a debriefing of what happened. Rayburn had investors who wanted to know where their exotic plants were to make overpriced drugs with. All I could think about, sitting in the hospital bed, was how much I hoped none of those things would ever make it into a city. And whether or not that small but growing black mark on my forearm was an infected cut, or what Rayburn had